Are you ready to take your first steps towards financial freedom by investing in property? Whether you're a first-time investor or you've started your portfolio but need some help continuing to grow, 2022 REB Buyer's Agent of the Year and Rising Star finalist Lachlan Vidler and his team at Atlas Property Group are here to help. As experts in property investment, Lachlan and his team are ready to help you take your next step in growing your portfolio. By completing the research, sourcing and negotiations, Lachlan goes the extra mile to find you a high-performing investment property. Visit atlaspropertygroup.com.au to book in your discovery call absolutely free of charge.
This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Hello everyone, Grace Ormsby here. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. Pretty excited about today's episode. Obviously, there's been so much going on in property lately. I'm sure everyone who is listening on will completely agree. We've seen a very different market cycle beginning, a lot of talk out there on the consumer side of things about what's actually going on with property. We've seen developments changing. We've seen a lot of talk about construction costs blowing out, and this is all probably culminating in a crisis that has been a long time coming. We've been talking for a very long time about building defects and what that means for consumers, for people that are living in these properties, for landlords, for tenants. There's been some high-profile instances where defects have had a huge impact on the lives of people that are owning or investing in some of these properties. So I thought it was about time. We've seen it sort of rear its ugly head again. I thought it was about time that we had a bit of a chat to unpack this. So it's an absolute pleasure to be welcoming the President of Strata Community Association, New South Wales, Stephen Brell, to today's show. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
That's okay, Grace. Thank you so much for inviting me to your show.
I'm really, really looking forward to today's episode because there's so many things going on, and we've seen a lot of the press releases coming out of the Strata Community Association in New South Wales lately, and some of them have been really, really exciting, and some of them have been a bit less than exciting, as you probably would agree. And defects in some of these buildings is one of those topics, and it's not a new issue. It's been something that has been circulating now for quite a number of years, but obviously in a different market climate now, it's becoming more of an issue probably for some of those people out there. And we are seeing, developers going under. We're seeing construction costs becoming so much higher. So there's all these factors that are probably influencing that. But I'm sure you know more about all this than I do, which is why you're on today's show. So from your perspective, how widespread is that issue of defects? How much attention do investors and would-be purchasers need to be paying attention to it?
Look, it is certainly a factor when you're considering buying an apartment. Coming from very much a New South Wales perspective, because that's where our association is based and where I'm located. So I think all around Australia, people have heard, if I mention the name Mascot Towers or Opal Towers, most of those names sort of resonate with most people across the country. So following those incidences in New South Wales back in 2018, the New South Wales government was very proactive and they put in place the building commissioner, David Chandler. So he's been in that role now for 3 years, and he has taken fairly significant steps to try and alleviate, building defects and concerns in apartments in New South Wales. And I know in other jurisdictions, particularly in Queensland, Victoria, and even now in WA, they're considering similar things. So for a long time, the pendulum has been, with the developer side, stroke builder side, where, it was the laws, if I can say this, were sort of skewed in their favour, where they could quite easily phoenix a company or string owners along, through a building defect process and that sort of thing. But what David Chandler's done in New South Wales is open up new avenues for owners, and not only new avenues, but very cost-effective avenues for owners to pursue building defects should their property be, affected by them. So getting back to your specific question, how widespread, it's actually quite interesting. Working with David Chandler, our industry association association. And just for your viewers, we represent the strata community, so mainly strata managers, but also owners and residents of strata schemes as well. We work very closely with the Office of Building Commissioner in New South Wales, and we actually did the very first ever building defect survey of apartment owners and strata managers in New South Wales. And there was over 500 buildings that were part of that survey, which included 1,400 odd strata managers. And what they found was around 40% of the new buildings, so their buildings still under warranty in the last 6 years, around 40% of those reported some type of significant defects in their building. So, that's a fairly large chunk of the market. And obviously David's been brought in to try and clean all of that up and, restore confidence to the consumer and to the marketplace. So, people, investors and owners can buy with confidence.
Because 4 in 10, 2 in 5,
yeah,
they're not great odds for people that are looking to buy into a strata community, because a lot of apartment buildings do fall under that category.
Yeah.
How concerning should that be for people?
Look, on the surface, it is very concerning. The one thing which I would say, look, preparedness and research is the key. So one thing that New South Wales and David Chandler's bringing in, he's bringing in a rating system for developers and builders, which is called the Icert rating specification. And he rolled that out earlier this year. So what this will mean is if investors or apartment owners are looking to buy off the plan, they'll be able to not only look at the product online, but they'll also be able to look up the rating of the developer. And that rating is a government rating, which is put in place. It's a 5-star rating. So if you're a 5-star rated developer, means that you provide a good product with a few defects, and you come back and fix up and you abide by your warranties and that sort of thing. And obviously if you get a 1-star, it means you're a little bit dodgy and you should be a little bit concerned about it. So that's one tool that owners will be able to use to assist them with their confidence of buying an apartment. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think there are rumblings in other states that they want to bring in a similar rating process in that. The other thing which the Office of Building Commissioner is doing is that they are being very proactive on the ground right now with developments that are nearing completion. So they are undertaking spot checks on these buildings and issuing rectification orders to builders and developers before the strata scheme is even registered, making sure that these defects are addressed before owners, take occupation of the building. And then the third phase that he's doing with this, which is about to be rolled out, buildings that are still under warranty, he's also going to have a process in place that they be remediated and basically offer a lifeline for owners to pursue the developer using the force of government, if I can call it that. So previously, owners were largely left to their own devices, where it would mean they'd have to go out and get a lawyer, get an engineer, get a building defect consultant, then roll up to court and engage in a very costly legal process in order to get their defects rectified. He's trying to alleviate a lot of that process and basically, go back to the good old days when you had an Office of Building Commissioner who was on the ground and actually, enforcing rectification orders against builders. So for New South Wales, we think it's a great step in the right direction.
Some really good news there, Stephen.
Yep.
And I want to come back to some of that issue of defects, how widespread the issues are and what they kind of can be categorized into as well. But are there levels of seriousness when it does come to defects? Are some things when people are looking, especially when that rating system comes out, are there some things that are worse than other things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, in the survey that we did, waterproofing, not surprisingly, probably to most of your listeners, was the number one significant problem. So that's, obviously waterproofing internally and externally, i.e. showers, balconies, and then roofing systems, enclosures, and that sort of thing. Fire safety systems was the next most significant one. About 40% of the buildings that reported defects reported some type of defect with their fire safety. Now, fire safety is a little bit like insurance. You know what I mean? You don't really think about it until you need it. And obviously, when there is a fire, you want to make sure that those systems are working. Then it sort of goes down. Structurally was the next significant category, with about 25%, and then key services within the building. So things like security systems not working properly, or antenna systems not working properly, or those sorts of things. But most commonly waterproofing was the standout. At about 60% of buildings reported waterproofing issues. So yeah.
And that is substantial when you've got to really be ripping things up and putting them back up to get them fixed.
Yeah, it's a very destructive and invasive massive defect, because often, where the leak is actually emanating from is not where it's resonating from, if that sort of makes sense, So it often takes a lot of destructive testing to make sure that, you're actually getting the right spot. And then you need to find out, the problem with the old system was, in a court of law, the onus was on the owner to prove how the defect got there. And so that would often mean that they would have to get engineers in to rip, waterproofing up to say, yes, that's exactly what it was caused by. It was caused by a, defective installation or defective product or whatever it was. In some instances, it had nothing to do with the construction. It was something which a resident had done. For example, we've had examples of residents, drilling and putting, antennas and satellite dishes on their balconies, which breached the waterproofing membrane. That's what's the cause of the defect. So, there's a lot of things for an owner's corporation or body corporate to investigate when they're looking at defects.
But all great points and really, really good to note. And again, I thank you so much for taking the time today, because this is all vital information for anyone out there who is looking at a property at this point in time. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back soon with more from the President of Strata Community Association, New South Wales.
Ever wondered how you can invest like the top 1% of Australian property investors? Henderson Advocacy has been at the forefront of helping everyday Aussies improve their financial freedom. So if you're a savvy investor or someone just starting out on their property journey, give Henderson Advocacy a call today. Head to www.henderson.com.au. Don't invest alone. Invest smarter.
Welcome back to this episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm joined by Stephen Brell, the President of Strata Community Association, New South Wales. Stephen, just before the break, it was great to get some insight into what some of those defects are. Around 40% is actually a huge number of new builds to be having these defects. And some people would be out there thinking, I really don't like my odds when it's that high. But by the sounds of it and all this work that's been coming in with the new commissioner, like some of these will be resolved before they even become issues for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I mean, look, what his goal is to make sure that buildings are constructed properly. So then owners and residents, don't have to deal with the defects, ongoing. Regrettably, he was, this all came to light following, those buildings, Mascot and Opal. And regrettably, often, as is the case, we need to hit the bottom of the barrel before we can bounce back up again and get things fixed. So, it is, let's say, prosperous times ahead,
Good to know. And I mean, a lot of people have talked, there's always going to be that debate around whether people should go for established buildings or for new builds when they're going in and making a move, buying into a property, whether that be for owner-occupier reasons or as an investment, an investment prospect. Is there sort of a point in time, especially you talked about the good old days when there was some pretty harsh rules and laws in place against dodgy construction. When did this kind of lag and when has it picked up again? I'm just thinking there's probably sort of some time periods that people should be mindful of when they're doing their due diligence on purchases.
Yeah, absolutely. So this all sort of, in my world, anything constructed pre-2000 was under the old regime. So that's where it was, the old government inspection regime, where inspectors came out on site. They made sure that each step of the building process was done properly and it had to be signed off. In the late 90s, early 2000s, certainly in New South Wales, and again, I think other jurisdictions went down the same path, we introduced something called private certification, which took, let's say, that responsibility off local government and placed it into the hands of private certifiers. Now, whilst in theory this works, and it should work well, what was happening was a lot of certifiers were being lent upon very heavily by the developer just to say, hey, look, can you please sign off my project to make sure that it's compliant and everything like that. So there was a period from, say, the 2000s to, most recently, say, to 2020, where the quality of construction wasn't the greatest. And again, as a strata manager and owners who own those apartments, we're dealing with a lot of those legacy issues that are going on. Fortunately, most buildings that are now 20 odd years old, they would have had all their defects and so forth and fixed up by now. It just would have been a fairly painful process for those owners going through that regime. I would say now, anyone who's looking to purchase a property virtually from 2020 onwards, they can have some assurity that the property is going to be under a new regime where there is far more oversight from the regulator, making sure that the property is constructed properly. As far as advice for your owners is, again, I cannot stress enough the importance of doing your proper investigations and due diligence before you buy. So that in particular is a Strata search, a search of the Strata records to make sure, just to get a feel for the building. And the things that you should be looking at are things like, is there anything in the records about defects? And if there is, what has the owners corporation done to rectify them? What is the financial status of the building? Are the owners preparing for a rainy day and setting robust capital works funds or sinking funds and planning for that future maintenance? The other one will be just to get a general feel of what the community is within the building. Is there a lot of hostility going on within the building? Are there arguments between committee members? Are there arguments between residents? Or, is everything generally fostering along in a fairly harmonious sort of way? So they're the sort of three key things that I'd be telling your listeners to look for before they buy. And I mean, look, a Strata search costs a couple of $100, and for that sort of money, you can gain a lot of intel on the type of building or what type of building you want to buy into.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some great tips there. Thank you so much for sharing those. To anyone who missed those, rewind a little bit and write those down, because really, really worthwhile looking into. And while we have heard, so much negativity around the Opal Towers and Mascot Towers were both quite large, high-rise buildings. They're not the only ones that are being covered by these issues with defects, are they? No, they're not. I mean, no, all standard of Class 2 buildings, so that's all residential schemes, are being covered by the Office of Building Commissioner. And it's actually quite interesting. I know we've mentioned Opal a couple of times. I had the pleasure of interviewing the chairman of the Opal Towers, a fellow called Shady Iskander. Well, I had him on our SCA webinar a couple of weeks back, and he gave a fascinating insight into the journey that the Opal Towers owners have gone through. So you wouldn't recognise that building today. They've got all the defects in their property fixed. They've settled with the developer. And he said, in a really strange roundabout way, having the original panel crack was the best thing that could have happened to us, because it shone a spotlight on our building. The builder was very, they wanted to make sure that it was fixed. But the other thing that it did, they got all the other defects. They all came to light as well, because they had the government authorities in there. Like, they had the state engineer looking at their building. So he said, we basically got, virtually this free engineering report from the best engineer in the state to go through and tell us this is what the problems were. And he said, now they're all fixed. And he goes, we've probably got the safest and best built building in Sydney. So it was a lot of heartache. Don't get me wrong, a lot of heartache that they went through, those owners, but, they got there in the end. So out of what was a fairly shocking, story first up, they had a very, very good outcome. No, that's such fascinating insight, Stephen, isn't it? Just, that it can come full circle. And I guess, to anyone, because there's probably people listening here that have felt like they've been burned in the past by, strata problems and things going on, or they might be going through a situation at the moment. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and a lot of the regulations and rules that have come in the last couple of years even are going to be protecting these people. Yeah, it is. And I mean, look, one thing which I want to highlight, and part of the reason why I responded to, there's been a few bad news stories about Strata in the media lately. One was on the 7:30 report about defects, and there's been another one about a couple in Sydney who were about to get kicked out of their apartment because they weren't paying levies, or there was a significant upgrade in the building. And look, I sort of jumped in and said, guys, look, everyone needs to understand there's, 85,000 strata plans in New South Wales. All you ever hear about is the odd few where there are a couple of problems, so strata living is a great way to live. It's a great investment. It's a great lifestyle. It's great for tenants. It's great for owners. There's a lot of benefits to it. And I just want to try and get that negativity out of the market, because yes, it's got its challenges, but all property investment does. Even owning a single residential dwelling has its problems as well. But all in all, it does have this regulatory infrastructure in place to make sure that things are being maintained properly, and that owners can actually get on and manage and administer their properties and, have a really good investment. I'm going to actually make reference to one of the quotes that you have put out about this 730 report, just because I do feel like it kind of summarizes everything we're talking about today. And that's that everyone deserves a safe place to live. And if a building does have defects, residents and owners should feel reassured that they'll be resolved quickly and effectively. And sounds like that's, the news of the day. That's what people can be expecting. And it should be giving people confidence, whether they're going in as an owner-occupier or an investor, that it's still going to be a safe long-term investment for them.
No, absolutely. Yep.
We're going to take another break there. We'll be back soon with more from Stephen Brell.
It's time to get help. Interest rates are increasing. Inflation has hit an extraordinary 5.1%, and the chance to secure a golden egg property is getting narrower by the day. Dragan from Buyers Agency Australia has been presenting the facts and helping property investors make smarter, well-informed, educated decisions in property for years. So what are you waiting for? Get in touch with Dragan today at www.buyersagencyaustralia.com.au. Invest with integrity.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm joined by Stephen Brell, President of Strata Community Association, New South Wales. It's been a really fascinating chat so far, Stephen, all around defects and what's been going on. And I know how integral the Strata Community Association has been to pushing for some of this to actually happen. And it didn't happen overnight. It's probably been a pretty crazy few years for you all. And that's without even, mentioning the challenges of COVID and the like. But what is the Strata Community Association, especially in New South Wales at the moment, working on? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, that would be very interested in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, look, one of the key stones that which we put in place, which we have been working on for a number of years, last year we were granted a professional standards scheme under the professional standards legislation. And we're quite proud because we're the first in the property sector to actually gain that accreditation. So what professional standards is all about, it's really about consumer protection. Okay. And how can we as professional strata managers, really upskill ourselves and provide better services for the community, which in turn will provide greater protections for owners and residents within strata schemes. So we're on the very beginning of that journey with our association. But what it means for us, it means far more training for strata managers and of the nuances. And look, I look back, when I first started in strata management, which was back in the mid-90s, back then, buildings were relatively straightforward. You had a 3-story walk up, no lifts, no pools, fairly standard construction, and it wasn't, it was largely the administration. When you look at strata developments today, they are, cities within cities. We are looking at master plan communities, sometimes, upwards to 3,000 odd lots, in the property. Very, very sophisticated systems in these buildings. So we're looking at, fire systems, security systems, all types of new technologies that are going into buildings. EV charging is one, which right now is a very big push, obviously with all the green push, which is coming out for renewable energy and that sort of thing. So buildings themselves and complexes are far more sophisticated, today than what they were, 20, 25 years ago. So for us as professional strata managers, we really need to upskill ourselves to understand not only how the buildings work and what the apparatus that are in these buildings that we need to maintain. They're also coming out with very sophisticated administrative structures. So it's not uncommon within a single development where you may have 3 or 4 different strata plans that you're managing, and then overarching that, there is a building management committee, which you're managing as well. And the building management committee is responsible for the shared facilities, in that complex. So again, and these are the things that strata managers really have to upskill themselves on. And that's part of what the professional standards scheme, we hope, is going to deliver for strata managers and for consumers. So, yeah.
Pretty cool. And I can't imagine the bureaucracy that goes on with that, because, a lot of people as well, they know on a surface level, what the strata title actually means, but they probably don't know what they're actually buying into.
Yeah.
How much is it about educating, the end owners and occupiers of these kind of properties?
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, on the surface, strata living is fairly simple, right? However, as you rightly say, there is a huge lack of education through the entire, let's say, transactional phase. So, and again, I don't mean to throw, my cousins in real estate under the bus here. And again, well, just for complete transparency, I'm a licensed real estate agent and I did used to work in that field many years ago. But there is a severe lack of education at the sales point, both for off the plan sales and also just, existing market sales. So often owners are told things about strata living which aren't quite right. And so their expectation going in when they move into the dwelling is often quite contrary to what they've been told during the sales process. And that also goes through to the conveyancing and legal work that goes on, and again, if there's any advice which I can give your listeners, it's when you go through these transactions, right, make sure you're asking the right questions, particularly of your conveyancer, right, particularly of the sales agent. And then again, that third piece of the puzzle would be getting that strata search before you go in. This can be the simplest thing. So something as simple as, am I allowed to keep an animal in the property, right? And again, often there's the wrong advice given at the sales process. And I have to say, sometimes the salesperson might just say, oh, yes, you can keep an animal, no problems. But then the strata bylaws actually say something quite different, behind the scenes. So just making sure that these little checks and balances are done to make sure that you understand what you're buying and then understand the complexity of what you're buying. It's what you said before, really understanding, am I buying into a strata scheme? Am I buying into a scheme that has a multi-tiered administration structure? So is there a community association? Is there a building management committee involved? All of those sorts of things. Because as I said before, buildings today are getting very sophisticated. We're managing apartments now. We've got a building in Waterloo that has a rooftop cinema. For the owners, so, and
you don't see that every day.
No, you don't. And so these are the quirky things that developers are building into their apartments to attract, people to strata living, because it does provide so many amenities like that. So, yeah.
And one last thing I do want to touch on that you have brought up is around electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Because that has obviously gotten a lot of traction lately. There has been a bit of, a few murmurings about what that could actually mean. And I'd love from your perspective what the future brings for that, because, there is an increasing number of electric vehicles on the road. And I'm not going to name any names as to, what some of those cars look like, but they're quite identifiable. And obviously, if you own one of those vehicles, you've got to have somewhere where you can be charging it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is it's a fascinating subject matter in the strata space at the moment, because I heard, someone, this was an owner in a strata building, they were considering putting in EV charging stations in their basement. And the comment from this owner was, when you bought your petrol car, you weren't expecting there to be a Bowser in the basement. Why you're expecting there to be a Bowser for your electric vehicle in our basement? And I thought that's a really interesting take on all of this. I guess the expectation is there because there's electricity and there's power points and there's convenience for owners and residents to actually charge vehicles. So looking at this, yes, a lot of developers today are very much designing and constructing their developments with EV charging, in mind. And again, the beauty about that is obviously when it's pre-planned, they can make sure that the right infrastructure is going in place. They can make sure that the right amenities, charging facilities, and when I say charging, not just the electrical charging, but also the dollar charging, like, who's paying for it? Is the owners corporation paying for it? Is it a pay-per-click, type arrangement where residents come in? So new developments, yes, most developers are looking at that. As far as retrofitting EV charging into buildings, that's a whole nother piece. And again, there's a lot of investigation work that needs to go on here. The good news for your listeners is, and anyone thinking about doing this, there are government agencies that have been set up specifically for this purpose. So again, in New South Wales, there is the Electric Vehicles Council that's been set up, and there's also the Sustainable Council within New South Wales government. And they can provide great guidance for owners who are thinking about doing this, because often it's not just upgrading the infrastructure in your building. You also need to upgrade the infrastructure in the street. So the poles and wires outside may not actually be set up yet to actually facilitate, EV charging, in a particular area. And that's where these councils and government agencies can really assist. But first things first, before you undertake any sort of infrastructure project, you should be going through, doing your due diligence and making sure and saying, okay, what steps do we need to put in place and how should we be doing this? Because to your point, come another decade, I reckon 25% of cars are going to be electric. And then if you give it 2 decades, it's probably going to be, 50 to 70% are going to be electric vehicles, particularly if that trend, keeps going. So, very important things for owners to consider.
And I just want to preface to everyone who is listening, it does seem like a bit of a trivial thing to be bringing up, for a lot of people, do we really need charging stations in apartment buildings and to be thinking about this? But I think it does speak to the way, just the real world problems that are facing, strata communities and apartment buildings each and every day that are going to be adapting and changing depending on, external factors as well. So while electric vehicles for some may seem like a novelty at this point, there's plenty of other things that, it does bring up as well. We've seen, I hate to, just going off on a tangent here probably, but Foxtel, you don't see nearly as many of those satellites floating around anymore, but are buildings equipped to have NBN internet? They're the same kind of problems, just with different applications depending on what consumers and what communities are needing at a certain point in time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, a lot of strata buildings have had to be retrofitted for those facilities that you say. So satellite TV for sure. NBN is one right now that we're tackling as a sector, because a lot of the old copper lines are being, they're going to be made redundant in the next few years. So particularly for buildings that have elevators and so forth in them, they've got to solve the solution where they get the NBN phone lines into their lifts to make sure that the emergency lines work. And similarly for the fire lines and all that sort of thing. So these are all the challenges that we face out there in strata land. So
things I wouldn't have even thought of, but very good points to make. Yeah. You need those alive when the worst does happen. But
absolutely.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really, really enlightening conversation from my perspective. And I think our listeners will be taking away something from it as well. If at the very least, just, a confidence to go out there and potentially look at some of these communities or unit buildings or anything that's being constructed and know that it's going to be safe and fit for purpose and protect them in the long run.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, the government saw that there is a need to clean up the sector, and I'm very, glad to say that David Chandler has done an outstanding job thus far in the very short period of time that he's been in the position to try and, really turn the tide and restore confidence in the sector for owners and for the consumer. So, and I'm quite proud to be part of it. So it's all good.
It's definitely an ongoing conversation, Stephen. So I'd love to, keep this line of communication open with you. And I'll open it up to anyone that does have any questions. Send them through to editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au and we'll pass them along. We'll keep this conversation going because it is an important one to be having. And it's not going to be over, even with all these, rules and legislation changes and protections in place. We'll probably be seeing a lot more on this in the coming years.
No, absolutely. There will be for sure. It's an ongoing process, a little bit like painting the harbour bridge. We're always going to be on it. So to make sure that consumers are getting the best outcomes. So
absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time and looking forward to chatting again in the future.
No worries at all. Thank you for having me on.
To everyone who is listening at home, in the gym, in your car, wherever you might be, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please like or review us on whatever platform that you do listen to your podcasts on. And as I mentioned, email us editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au with any questions. As always, stay up to date with the latest on smartpropertyinvestment.com.au and on our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Until next episode, stay safe and well wherever you're listening from. Bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
It's safe to say the property market has been red hot over the last few years, with some of the markets we've selected in 2021 rising over 40% in a 12-month period. It's very likely that if you're a property owner, your property has gone up 20% minimum in value in the past 12 months, and you have most likely accrued sizable equity that can be recycled and extracted to build your investment portfolio. With interest rates increasing, You might be wondering where to invest to maximise capital growth and cash flow in 2022 and beyond. Well, to save you time, energy and guesswork, award-winning author and regular guest on the Smart Property Investment podcast, Paul Glossop and his team at Pure Property Investment have outlined the top 30 affordable suburbs poised for strong capital growth over the next few years with sound cash flow. Grab your free Top 30 Guide to Property Investment guide today at purepropertyinvestment.com.